Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Rome in America podcast. It's been a little while, but, we're going to get right into it. Before I get into it, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. That would really help me out a lot. Hit the like button and subscribe. So, and by the time this episode comes out tomorrow, tomorrow will be July 1st, and it's going to be a double feature, actually. I was going to record, so I'm recording this on the evening of June 30th. I was going to release it earlier today, but then I ultimately decided, I'm not going to have time to release it at the normal time that I release it, so I decided, you know what? We're going to make July 1st a double feature. I'm going to release one episode at approximately noon, and then I'll release the other one at my normal time of 5 p.m. later that day. So July 1st, keep a weather eye out because it's going to be a double feature. We're going to have 2 episodes get released in the same day, which is something I've never done before on this podcast. But, we're going to get rolling. So today I'm going to talk about something that happened last week. It happened a week ago, but it is something that I just want to catch people up on. And it is just to, talk about the state of worldly affairs and how quickly things can go off the rails and, essentially serve as a warning to what might come next. So for those who probably followed international politics and international news, people probably heard the story about how the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Keir Starmer, resigned on Monday, June 22nd. Starmer put out not a tweet. He was at, I don't know if it was right outside his home in Downing Street or wherever it was, but it was somewhere in London, basically somewhere parliamentary, somewhere political, somewhere in London. He was at a podium and he gave essentially a live announcement, talking about that he was going to resign. He was going to basically announcing his resignation. And the reason why this is significant is because what it does seem to show is that all it really does show is the continuing political instability inside the United Kingdom and inside, British politics and stuff like that. And so for those who don't know, Keir Starmer is not the first prime minister, obviously, but he's not, at least in modern times, in recent times, he's not the first prime minister to resign. So in the last 30 years or so, I should say 25 years, and since the beginning of the 21st century, there has been a laundry list at this point now of prime ministers from Britain who resigned and or did not serve a full term for various different reasons. And so I'm going to go through the list today. And disclaimer, I'm not an expert in British politics, but I can tell you what I do know about it, just as sort of a Cliff Notes version of what has happened in Britain over the last 25-ish years. So at the beginning of the 21st century, the Prime Minister of Britain was a man named Tony Blair. Those who were around in the 2000s probably know exactly who he was. He became Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1997 after almost 20 years, I think. Excuse me. He became Prime Minister of Britain after almost 20 years, I believe, of Conservative Party rule in Great Britain. There was obviously an 11-year rule under Margaret Thatcher from 1979 to 1990, and then a man whose name escapes me was then, who was also a member of the Conservative Party, was Prime Minister from 1990 to 1997. Then in 1997, Tony Blair, who's a member of the Labour Party, became Prime Minister. And initially, he was doing a lot of reforms, a lot of labor reforms, but he ultimately failed in certain other areas. And there were certain things that derailed his tenureship as Prime Minister. The biggest one, of course, though, was his support and basically him getting Britain involved in the Iraq War. So because people forget that when the United States invaded Iraq in the spring of 2003, it was part of a large coalition of countries, actually. Well, actually, not a large, but it was part of a coalition of countries that invaded the country and sent a certain number of troops to the country. So, for example, the United States, obviously, we sent almost 200,000 troops into the country. We were the main country that was invading. Then you had the United Kingdom. They sent in about an additional 45,000 troops into the country, and really they got involved in the war for no other reason other than emotional support for their greatest ally, the United States. And so that they had them, and then I think Australia, which of course has close ties to the United Kingdom, but Australia sent, I think, about 2,000 or so soldiers in, and then you had Poland, which sent in about 100 troops or so. So you basically had these four countries that decided to participate in the initial invasion of Iraq, and basically the duration of that war. Well, obviously this made Tony Blair extremely unpopular within the country, and his continued support for the war, not just the initial invasion, his continued support for the occupation of Iraq during the insurgency campaign, basically caused his popularity to continue to decline over the next 4 years. And, he kept making certain other mistakes that he faced criticism for and all that stuff. Ultimately, then, in June of 2007, he then ultimately resigned. And the same day he resigned as prime minister, he also gave up his parliamentary seat. So not just as prime minister, he also resigned from parliament that exact same day. And so then his successor was another Labour MP named Gordon Brown. And I don't really know much about Gordon Brown, but his party then ultimately lost the elections in the year 2010. And so he somewhat resigned, but somewhat lost. So his situation was a little iffy. And then the Prime Minister of Britain became David Cameron. So David Cameron was a Conservative MP, and basically what it did was it restarted over a decade of Conservative rule within Great Britain, although it might have been you might as well just call it liberal rule, because at this point, the Conservative Party, or the Tories as they're also known, they're not real conservatives. They're basically just liberals who want tax cuts, but that's beside the point. So in 2010, David Cameron becomes Prime Minister of the UK, and he serves for about 6 years. Then in 2016, a referendum passes called Vote Leave. And for those who don't know, Vote Leave was essentially Brexit, which was where essentially the United Kingdom withdrew from the European Union. And this obviously was, one of the biggest political deals of the decade was Brexit. And basically, he had done what he could, I think, if I remember correctly, to stop the referendum from passing. And so when the referendum finally passed, he ultimately resigned in disgrace. And this was in the summer of 2016. Then the prime minister became a woman named Theresa May. And she, faced there were also certain other referendums similar to Brexit that passed while she was MP, if I remember correctly, or if I learned correctly. And ultimately then in the summer of 2019, she also resigned. Then we got, of course, the man that other people are familiar with, named Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson became prime minister in the summer of 2019, and he essentially started off as a somewhat Trumpian figure. At least that's how he was portrayed, was being the British version of Trump. He had populist rhetoric and messaging. He had goofy, weird blonde hair. People, essentially called him, essentially the Trump of British politics in certain ways. And that was, some people anyways. But ultimately, he was a failure too, because under his leadership, they had, I don't know if it was his leadership or just conservative leadership, but he was definitely part of it. Net 1 million migration into the country. So in other words, he did nothing to quell the mass migration crisis that was unfolding in Britain since the 2000s, really. And obviously over in Europe, in Britain and many countries in Europe, mass migration is the number one issue. It's the number one issue that they talk about all the time. Well, he did nothing to quell mass migration. some people criticized him over his COVID policy. And then, of course, one of his cabinet members became involved in a scandal in which he was accused of sexual assault and other sexual misconduct. And the allegations then were that Johnson knew of these allegations against him, and instead of relieving him from his position, he kept him around. And when these allegations then floated to the surface, ultimately then in the summer of 2022, Johnson himself resigned. And this went into effect, he announced it in July of 2022. Then in September is when his resignation went into effect. And he was succeeded by another Conservative MP named Liz Truss. Now, Liz Truss introduced some sort of mini budget referendum, piece of legislation in Parliament, which created a bit of a financial sort of instability crisis. And ultimately, after just 49 days, she then also resigned from her post as prime minister, making her, to this day now, the shortest-serving prime minister in British history. She served only 49 days, so that's only 7 weeks she was on the job. And then in October, she was succeeded by a man named Rishi Sunak, who, obviously that is not a British-sounding name. He obviously is of Indian origin. He's born in Britain, but his parents are Indian. And he obviously did nothing to quell the mass migration crisis anyways. And he, like Boris Johnson, also continued the United Kingdom providing military aid to Ukraine, which, by the way, is another thing that made Johnson somewhat unpopular that led to his resignation. There was a lot of things, of course, but Sunak continued this throughout his prime ministership. Then in the summer of 2024, Britain held elections, and Sunak essentially because the Conservative Party lost a lot of seats, and they lost their position as the majority in the House of Commons, which would be the essentially the British equivalent of the U.S. House of Representatives. He also had to give up his seat as prime minister. I think he remained a member of Parliament, but he definitely he was forced into stepping down as prime minister because of the election losses. And then in September 2024, we get Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, of course, did not do anything to help the political crisis that was unfolding in Britain. He continued military aid to Ukraine. He did nothing to quell the mass migration that was unfolding in the country. And not only that, but then we started seeing all of these cases unfold under his tenure as prime minister. We saw all these cases unfold of certain British civilians getting, either injured or murdered, outright killed by military-age men who were of a migrant background of some kind, where either they themselves were migrants or their parents were migrants that came into the country. And this, of course, culminated in certain, things such as the killing and then eventual outrage over the killing of Henry Novak. And then, of course, the Belfast riots, based off of an attempted killing there. And also on top of that, the fact that Keir Starmer cracked down heavily on freedom of speech, where it was reported that annually an estimated 12,000 British citizens would get arrested for posting something on social media that the government deemed to be xenophobic or racist or Islamophobic was the thing. And of course, all this did was pour gasoline on the fire that was Keir Starmer's leadership. And then ultimately, roughly 1 week before, and again, I'm not sure that this is what caused him to resign, but it is awfully coincidental, and people would say that this was a contributing factor, was that about a week or so before Keir Starmer ultimately announced his resignation, there was something released by a report released called the Rape Gang Inquiry Report, where basically the report detailed essentially the grooming gangs by foreign nationals, particularly Pakistani nationals, amongst young British girls, and how the British and how oftentimes these members were either never arrested. These members of these grooming gangs were either never arrested or immediately released following their arrest, and were never put into either federal prisons or into insane asylums, depending on their mental state. And the reason why the British government didn't want to crack down on these people is because they were afraid of being deemed Islamophobic or racist of some kind. And of course, all this did was have the opposite effect. You know what I mean? And so, all this did was, this report was released of essentially grooming gangs and their essentially crimes they've committed against young British girls. And in total, it documented crimes committed against roughly 250,000 British citizens over a period of about 30 years, really since the 1990s. And this report was released by an MP named Rupert Lowe, who started off, early in his political career as a Conservative MP before becoming independent, and then also spending a little time with Reform UK before he was ultimately kicked out of the party by Nigel Farage. And then he started his own political pressure movement, which then eventually was launched back in February, officially into a political party called Restore Britain. And so Rupert Lowe released this rape gang inquiry report, which was then also retweeted by Elon Musk, which helped amplify and spread the word about these crimes committed. And by the way, tomorrow, this is going to be the second part of the double feature. Tomorrow, I'm going to do an episode listing in detail some of the stuff that's written in the report, just because it's very interesting stuff. And so basically, so keep in mind watch out for that. So anyways, Starmer ultimately resigned in disgrace, and from what it looks like, his replacement isn't going to be much better, if at all. But what it does show, at least, is that the people of Britain clearly have prioritized mass migration as their biggest political issue, and they have deemed it a worthy issue to start being outraged about and showing the world that, and also people in Ireland, technically, if you count Northern Ireland as part of Ireland or whatever, but some people will still say it's part of Britain. But anyways, point is, there are people who are seeing this, especially in Britain, saying mass migration is destroying our country, and our leaders are not doing anything about us. It's almost like that saying, basically, and what they're trying to do essentially, especially if you're a Labour MP, and I suppose to a certain extent if you're a Conservative MP, because why, it's almost like a difference a distinction without a difference. But basically, instead of going after the people that are actually causing the problem, they're going after the people who are noticing the problem. And they're trying to convince everyone that Pakistanis and Somalis and Bangladeshis and all these people are completely assimilable, can completely and very quickly that they are capable of assimilating into British culture, when in fact that's not true, for a number of reasons. And Islam obviously is a big part of it. You can't assimilate Islam into a nation that is historically Christian. It's just not possible, and it just does not bode well. You can't mix oil and water together, as they would say. But the thing is, you have politicians in Britain who are trying to convince the public that they are totally assimilable, that they must assimilate, that they will assimilate, and that you're the problem if you notice that they can't assimilate. And so it's like, and this is another saying that I've heard quite a bit, it's like the It's like the shepherd trying to convince the sheep that wolves are vegetarians. It's just not right. It's incongruent with reality, and it's ultimate gaslighting at the end of the day. And so, hey, look, I'm glad Keir Starmer finally resigned. I don't really expect his successor to be much better, but hopefully this momentum that is starting to be gained in Britain continues. I hope some of it bleeds over here into America, because a lot of American and British politics tend to overlap for various reasons. And so, I hope it has a good after effect. I don't know what the future will hold, but, honestly, I really do hope that things change for the better. And, that is going to include, like bans on hijabs and Sharia law and mass deportations and all that stuff. That's what the country needs. That's what Britain needs. That's what America needs. But, I would say Britain much more, because they're at much more of the receiving end of it than we are. But yeah, I really do hope that things start to change for the better. And, I hope that the people of Britain ultimately decide that they've had enough, and they decide that, hey, we're going to make this country change if our leaders won't. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about today. And yeah, like I said, at the time I'm recording this episode, it is in the evening. Tomorrow at noon, this will be released. And then at 5 o'clock is when the second episode of the day will be released. And like I said, the second episode will be, I will give a detailed inside look into Rupert Lowe's rape gang inquiry report. And hopefully you will learn a little bit of it from it, as I will. So thanks for sticking around. Make sure, once again, hit the like button, subscribe. Thank you for hanging out, and I'll see you all in the next episode.